Kia ora koutou, Ginny Dudansky. I'm the Wormwise Program Manager. Was lucky enough to start my career with Trevor at what was Manawatu Vet Services many moons ago. And yeah, lucky that I still get to ring him up and pick his brain when I need to. So awesome, as for last week, awesome that we're going to get to download a bit more of that tonight, talking about intensive lamb finishing systems. Probably touched on a wee bit of that lamb finishing stuff last week, but now we get to do a deep dive. So welcome, Trevor.
Okay, thanks, Ginny. For those that were tuned in last week, I recognise that you are all consenting adults, so you're going to hear some of that stuff again, but because you are consenting adults, you'll need to hear it again and again and again before it actually sinks in and it actually provokes you to do something different. So for those of you that's the first time, you will have to download it and listen again and again. And we are going to focus on systems, and and drench will come into the discussion. Last week I made a point where the discussion was not about drench, but because we're talking about lamb finishes, they are in a very precarious position because they rely on drench much more than other systems probably need to, even if they do use lots of it. So we'll be presenting a bit more about the use of drench. Now, when we look at worms, I make a point of progressing this. I will be telling you stuff that you would have heard before. I mean, we're not preaching a different message from the ones that we were preaching 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. And so you've all heard it. And you could say that we've failed miserably as communicators because largely the messages that we were preaching way back then haven't really had much impact on where we are now. And you ask, why have we not implemented it? And I think it's a failing because this chappie here, I'm sure he had heard messages about not being too fat and the danger of eating pies, because I'm sure he's eating a really meaty and fatty pie. And so it's a failing that we have as a species of not really doing actions to protect the future. And certainly that's where we are now, because we haven't done that. So the principles are accepting that our livestock will always have worms. It's part of a natural symbiotic relationship almost, that worms will always be in our livestock. The danger is when we have too many of them, that's when they cause us problems. And also what's made it worse in our sheep systems, we've had years and years and years of selecting our sheep for production traits, which has not in any way selected them for their ability to cope with worms. We're now in catch-up mode where there are breeders trying to do that, but we've got a long history of selecting for traits, production traits, which selected negatively for those animals' ability to cope with worms. And we look at our wild populations. I often think of this: our wild populations don't die of worms. In fact, the wild goats do. We see them die in droughts because they don't get enough to eat, but in general our wild populations cope with worms. And I often think, how do we mimic that? Because when you think of those wild populations, they don't run all their young animals together. They mix their young animals up with their older animals. Yet we set up these production systems where we run all our young animals together and expect that parasites are not going to be a problem. It's a system that parasites love, that we run all our young animals together. So when we look at the general toolbox, genetics is in that toolbox, but I think in lamb finishing systems, genetics almost don't come into the mix at all. We need to remember that feeding animals well, even our young animals, enables them to cope better, and I'll come back to that. And the biggie is in that toolbox is grazing plans, how we use a grazing system to manage worms, whereas historically we have relied on drench to manage worms, where in actual fact we need to be thinking of a grazing system. So I'm going to start with this worm cycle that you will have all seen, where there's a belly full of worms inside that animal. In this case, it looks like it's in the abomasum, but it could be in the small intestine. Those worms have just like all other animals, there's males and females, and they mate, and a product of that mating is the females will lay eggs. Those eggs come out and drop onto the ground, and if it's warm and moist, those eggs will hatch. And out of that egg will come in a first stage larvae, an L1. And if it's warm and moist, that will molt to an L2. And if it's warm and moist, that will molt to an L3. And the product that comes out of that free living stage that's on the pastures is an L3. And the L3 is the little villain, that the one we have to manage, because that's the one that the animal gets reinfected with and sets up the cycle again. So the things you need to remember or identify out of that cycle are that free living stage only happens when it is warm and moist. So in the far north, maybe a lot of the year it never gets low enough that it stops that free living stage. For the rest of the country, I think for a big chunk of this winter, it has been too cold for that free living stage to happen. But that free living stage, it has to be warm and moist. And remember, it pretty well only happens on grass. So the worms that we deal with in our livestock systems have evolved or been part of livestock coming out of pastoral grazing systems, and they are best suited to pastures. So when we recognise that, we realise that one of the tools we have is around the use of pastures. Whereas the product at the end, which I said the one that was the end of that free living stage, was the L3. And the L3s are very hardy. They cope with cold. In fact, on all your farms, the L3 larvae that are on the pastures now largely came from last autumn. In fact, they last for a long time when they are cooler. And they also like long grass, because one of the things is they don't like sunlight. So long grass really suits them. And they also do not like being dry. So remember that L3 larvae are very hardy, survive the cold, and they do not like being dry or in sunlight. So this is a beautiful picture that we've used forever, just showing what those L3 larvae look like. They're in a bubble of water that sits on that grass blade. They can move up and down that grass blade, but that's the villain, that's the critter that we have to try and control if we're going to use a grazing system to manage worms. So remember, the bits to remember from this is that when our lambs are consuming L3 larvae, they eat less. They have a lower appetite, so they eat less. And it's not a way of conserving feed. We also know that lambs, if they're given the choice, will avoid the bits of pasture that have got lots of L3 larvae on them. We also know that the impact of those worms, once they molt further and become adults in the gut, the impact will depend on the animal's age. So in this case, we're talking about lambs, which means they are very vulnerable. They're most vulnerable because they have not had the opportunity to develop an immunity. Their immune status, so that will develop as they grow as a lamb, and how we manage them influences the speed at which they develop immunity, and hugely is their level of nutrition. So those factors all impact on the impact of worms. And this is a graph that looks very scientific, but it is what it's showing us is that lambs that are gobbling up 1,000 L3 larvae a day don't grow much slower than lambs that are getting no L3 larvae a day. Whereas at the other extreme, we've got lambs that are getting 5,000 L3 larvae a day, and the impact on their growth rate. And even drenching them every 21 days only captured back some of that live weight gain. So when we looked at and put that in terms of production, if we've got lambs that are putting on 15 kilos, so they've only grown 153 grams a day, and at say $4, they've put on $60 worth if they have not consumed any L3 larvae, which we can set up systems that are like that. If they're having a low intake of larvae, and that might be 1,000, it sounds a lot, but in actual fact, that's a low intake. It has an impact on their growth rate and drops how much they earn. And as we keep going, and increase that intake, it just has an impact on their growth rate and, of course, their value. And if we have them gobbling up 5,000 L3 larvae a day, they're going to be significantly less value because of that. And even if we drench them, we don't capture back all of that lost production as a consequence. And that is because they're eating those L3 larvae, they are eating less. So that's a representation of the cost or the benefit. I tend to look at it as a benefit. If we can put our lambs into a situation where they're consuming less L3 larvae, the prize is they will grow faster. So the benefit of setting up such a system is they have a high appetite, so of course they grow faster. And if they have a gradual exposure to L3 larvae, they will develop an immune response far quicker than if we overwhelm them with L3 larvae, which is what's happening on most of our farms. If they are on a low worm challenge and grazing system, they'll have less production loss altogether from having an actual worm burden, so having adults inside them that are interfering with their digestive system. We also have that they are moving into a lower contamination state, so they're not contaminating the farm as much because they're not accumulating such a large worm burden. And of course, they have a lesser need to drench. So there's huge benefits of us setting up systems where they are consuming less L3 larvae. So when we look at grazing plans, it's all about looking at the contamination, stop ongoing contamination exposure. So on farms throughout the country, the standard has been for lambs to contaminate pastures and for them then to be exposed to that contamination, which they then build up to even higher levels of contamination. And the more that we let that happen, the higher the level of contamination that we have. So the grazing plan one of the objectives has to be that it stops the annual accumulation of contamination. And we know, as I said earlier on, that the contamination on most of our pastures right now was put there last autumn, and it's highly, highly accumulative. So when we look at one of the objectives, it's to minimize that annual accumulation of contamination. So that means that we have the ability to stop one season setting up the challenge in the next. So we need to know where the contamination is coming from. Most of it is coming from lambs under 9 months of age. Lambs under 9 months of age are most susceptible to worms. So when they have got a worm burden, those worms are laying the maximum number of eggs because they've got no immune pressure on them. Those eggs have had no immune pressure on them, so they largely hatch. So lambs are most of the contamination on our farms comes from lambs up until going into the winter. So when we look at our grazing plans, it is all about managing lambs over that late spring through to early winter. So if we're not dealing with merinos, our adult sheep are largely not contaminators. So our adult ewes are largely net decontaminators. We might see egg counts in them, we might think they're wormy, but largely they are not contaminators. And remember that those lambs that they are contaminating grass. Now, there will be times when we see crops, particularly older lucerne crops, that have accumulated some contamination, but for most of our systems, the contamination is all based around grass. So when we look at lamb finishing systems, the toolbox that we've got available to us is quite small. We have no adults in most of them. And in our standard, our mixed species, not our more mixed systems, adults are actually a very, very important tool in managing the level of contamination and trying to reduce that level of contamination. Whereas most in our pure lamb finishing system, there are no adults. We don't have any alternate species, so we don't have any cattle in those systems. So sheep and cattle largely don't share parasites. They do to some extent, but to all intents and purposes, when we're looking at ways to reduce the contamination, cattle would be one of the tools that we can use to lower that contamination. But we look at most of our lamb finishing systems, they don't have any cattle. And a lot of those lamb finishing systems are almost 12-month systems. So there are lambs in that system for at least 9 months, and certainly for the late spring through to early winter, they are the only animals there are lambs. So we've got a system that only carries the animals that are most susceptible, and we only carry the animals that are most highly contaminatable. So the ones that do most contamination. So you can see with lamb finishing systems, they're peculiar almost because they're extreme of us not being like a natural system where that don't run young animals together. And what we do in a lamb finishing system, we plonk just them into a system. So when we look at those tools, crops are wonderful because crops largely do not carry L3 larvae. Young grass has come out of a cropping system, so that whole process has left that with low levels of contamination. I put subdivision in there because it is a tool which is hugely powerful in us being able to control where animals graze, and so therefore have some control over where contamination is and how we might avoid ongoing exposure to that contamination that's been created. So subdivision in every respect is a very powerful tool, even just for enabling to maintain high pasture quality, which for lambs is hugely powerful in reducing in increasing their ability to cope with worms. Silage and hay areas, you look in all the textbooks and they say silage and hay areas are those clean areas. Well, I'll come back to that because in my experience, we overstate that, just how clean they are. Time is in that mix of tools because our pasture contamination, as much as I said L3 larvae last for a long time, long periods of time will reduce that population. And wherever we can use time, it is one of the tools, very useful tools for reducing the level of contamination. And of course, nutrition and genetics, which I'll come back to.
Trev, just before you move on, touching on a couple of things that you said there. One, about the cleanliness of crops and, lambs are only contaminating grass. So, because we've all seen those failures on crops. So
yes.
is that always because there is grass in the crop somewhere or grass around the edges of the crop, do you think?
Yes, very much. And I should have expanded on that. I'll come to that, Ginny. I'll come to that. Now you put me off my stride. Oh yes, I had nutrition in that mix of tools, and of course in our lamb finishing systems, largely they will be being fed, so it's less likely to be a limiting factor that it might be in our other systems. So when we look at lamb finishing systems, historically and even still, they rely heavily on drench. And if we have a system where lambs have to be drenched frequently, they can never achieve their maximum live weight gains, because the intake of L3 larvae, no matter how frequent they are drenched, will limit their appetite. So systems that rely heavily on drench are just unsustainable, just from a performance point of view, but certainly drench failure will follow as a consequence of those systems that are heavily used drench. And I think as much as we've blamed persistent acting drenches products as a big driver of our current drench resistant status, in my experience, I think we've understated or under-recognised the cost of drenching lambs frequently every 28 days for 4, 5, or even 6 months as one of the big drivers of selection for drench resistance. So really, I'm saying I don't think we can ever carry on having systems that rely heavily on drench.
And I think just to butt in there too, I think that 28-day drench thing was a really easy thing for people to latch onto, as was using combination drenches. But when you look at the work that established the 28-day drench as being a sustainable thing, it always had the lambs sharing grazing areas with undrenched ewes, and that certainly hasn't been the case in these systems that we're talking about.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So when you look at that, it just says we have to enlist a forage program as part of our worm management toolbox, and we cannot carry on with any system, no matter where it is, that relies heavily on frequent drenching as the tool for managing worms.
And so, you mentioned lambs always being on good feed and lamb finishing systems, but, I drive around the North Island and I see lots of lambs on pretty short feed, and we call that backgrounding. What's the role for backgrounding, and what's going to happen to our winter lambs in all of this?
Not sure what you mean quite. I mean, you're right. At the moment, likewise, I'm driving all over the country and seeing lambs on very short feed. So the nutritional support for them coping is certainly not there.
Yes, I guess I just mean those lambs, growing quite slowly through an autumn on a trader's property,
Yes.
and then being ramped up to finish faster, or just finish slowly over the winter.
Yes, I often think though, when that is the situation, we've got very short pastures. So how much is the ultraviolet light actually, minimising that L3 contamination level? I mean, there is actually a positive side to having short pastures. It's not about feeding them well, but it could well be about avoiding, reducing the level of contamination. So when we look at these forage programs, as part of our toolbox for managing worms, I think summer autumn lamb finishing on just pastures is not sustainable, because they can't avoid that worm challenges will accumulate and therefore be highly dependent on the use of drench. And the whole process of cropping, and I think even just desiccating and direct drilling in crop, or even new pastures, seems to disturb the whole free living stage to be very effective way at producing a grazing that has got very, very low levels of L3. So hence, the lots of reasons why a forage program is so powerful in managing worms. So when we look at the options, summer crops, they are by far the best option. And while those lambs are on that area of crop, they are not contaminating the farm. They're not out somewhere else on the pastures contaminating. They're plonking any contamination they had onto a platform which is largely not going to be multiplied up. And of course, the crops usually provide good feeding. So following up with Ginny's comment before around, seeing seeing wormy lambs on crops. It is because of the grass. So the work that I did on one of the big finishing farms, where we just monitored worms on that, in their system, and on that farm they were really, really good croppers. So we had paddocks of summer crop. In this case, it was brassicas. There, where there was no grass, we drenched lambs onto those, and there was fecal egg counts just did not rise. Soon as they went onto those paddocks that had pasture in them, the fecal egg counts began to rise. And when we look at some, and I think it's exaggerated when that summer crop is a brassica, because lambs by choice won't eat a brassica, but we plonk them on a brassica, and they don't go and eat that as fast as they can. They go and eat any grass that they can find. And in the early days of when pasture or hunter came on, that was being used, we used to see significant parasitism on, because lambs by choice will never eat that crop. And so they absolutely deck the pastures that are around the edges, and picked up every L3 larvae that were there. So I stick with my experience, and particularly out of the finishing farm where we did the monitoring, it is very much around minimising grass in those crops. So as I said, you look at any book and it says that lambs being weaned onto silage paddocks or paddocks that have had hay on are going to be clean. Without question, if that paddock was lambed on before it was locked up for those, it will not be clean. I guess in the lamb finishing system, they are unlikely to have had ewes on those pastures. But remember that L3 larvae love long grass, which is what silage is. And I think, in my experience, it's highly variable as to how clean silage or hay paddocks are after that's been made. And it's interesting, the work that I do overseas in the UK, they time their weaning for when they can put them back onto silage aftermath. But on the farms where we've done that monitoring over there, those lambs get parasitised. So it's even for them that have relied on that, I think they've overstated how clean that pasture's been.
We've got a hand raised there.
Yeah.
I don't know whether, Seamus, whether you can speak or your mic's turned off. Otherwise, pop your question in the chat. Maybe question in the chat.
Okay.
Sorry, go on, Trev.
Yep.
No, don't go on. When Trevor says grass for L3 ingestion, does this include multi-year clover, like I guess a red clover?
Oh, red clover. I mean, I just love red clover. I've had lambs on red clover, just fecal egg counts don't rise at all. Else, the whole free living stage just does not cope with red clover. As well as it being a very good feed, it certainly remains worm free as long as there's no grass in it.
Yes, and I remember some of John Neeson's work at Flock House with lambs that did actually have quite high egg counts and were still growing really fast when they were on a pure clover sward. So that nutrition from clover, it's a double whammy, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. And so the next one was new grass. So new grass has come out of a system that wasn't contaminated. We've done stuff to it to establish our new grass, and it's of our pastures, it's going to be as clean as you can get. And so our new grass is very clean. And I'll come back to this later, because it's very clean, it is a high risk. And so our new grasses are never ever going to remain clean. And lambs that go onto that with low levels of contamination will gradually increase that level of contamination. And I'd suggest if the contamination exposure cycle has been able to repeat up to 3 times, we will start getting a live weight gain cost as a result of the L3 intake. Obviously, this is a huge issue if it's spring sown, much less of an issue if it's autumn sown and going into the cooler part of the year.
Just another question for you before you go on to that first grazing of new grass. Just a question here about the length of grass. You've mentioned that L3 larvae love long grass. How long is long grass?
Well, when you look at that stuff, that pasture, that L3 picture, most of the L3 larvae accumulate around that 3 to 5 centimetres off the ground. That's where they like to live, and so grass that is longer than that is actually helping them survive that length. So while we're on the new grass, because this is a big deal, and I think how do we first graze new grass and not have a risk? So there's 3 farming systems in the North Island that I have been involved with. They're not part of the decision making, that are now got massive levels of drench resistance because they were, one case was 2 of them were cattle farms that were turned into sheep farms, and the other was a sheep farm that was turned into a cattle farm. And both of them, all animals going onto them were drenched, and within months we had significant drench resistance. So that is what has been happening on our new grass paddocks for a long time, that lambs have been drenched onto new grass. And because the new grass is just a little part of the total farm, it's not obvious that something's happened. But again, it's accumulative. We've done that every time when lambs have been drenched onto new grass, we will have generated a small population of worms that carry the resistant genes. And year after year after year after year, we've been doing that, and that resistant population will have gradually accumulated. So how do we first graze it? If we were dealing, at the bottom there, I've got employer U-mob. If we're in our standard sheep and beef system, where we've got some ewes, a very easy way of reducing that risk, but not over-contaminating it so we lose its advantage of being clean pasture, is to lightly first graze it with ewes. But in most of our lamb finishing system, there are no ewes. So what are the other tools? We need to, as we drench lambs onto them, we need to leave some not treated, or we drench them after they've been on for a day or 2. Both of those techniques, which while very effective at minimising the risk of when we drench relative to when they graze there, run the risk of adding more contamination than we want onto a platform which otherwise is low contamination pasture. So I've got there employing a U-mob, and it's interesting when we come to actual systems, what they're doing, they have actually employed ewes in their lamb finishing system as a tool to manage worms. So then I come to nutrition and genetics and time and subdivision. Now I put them all together, not because they're not important, but when we look at lamb finishing systems, they are largely set up around better feeding. So therefore, nutrition is unlikely to be a factor that's limiting their ability to cope. And genetics certainly is not, because most lamb finishing systems are purchasing lambs from assorted sources, where the specs that they're buying them on are not about their genetics, but about more likely their breed, their sex, their weight, that are determining the spec that they're purchased. Time is still an important tool. In lamb finishing systems, it's very difficult to be creating time gaps that we might use to lower that level of contamination. But subdivision is still there as a tool where we might be able to extend those grazing intervals between grazing, which creates which enables us to use that time tool as one of the tools. subdivision to me is in all our systems. That's why just today I've been at a discussion group where we had the talk about the collars on cattle, and I think the collars are just going to be a massive gain as part of overall pasture management, which in turn could be used as a worm management tool. Whereas if we look at a finishing system, and there's whole lots of farms that have got a lamb finishing component to their overall system that will have a breeding component to it, and it'll have a cattle component to it. And the big difference is that those systems have adults. And as I said earlier on, ewes are a very powerful tool for lowering the level of contamination. They usually have cattle. So using cattle as an alternate species that that we can use to create time. It's not that cattle gobble up a whole lot of sheep worms, it's just that cattle are not sheep. And so they're a very powerful tool to be grazing pastures and allowing time to be the process of reducing the level of contamination. Of course, we've got crops, and we've got young grass, and we've got subdivision, and we've got hay, and we've got time. And so in our mixed species systems, we've got a bigger toolbox that we can use where we're using our grazing system for managing worms. Not saying we're not using drench, but we're much more able to be generating grazing systems where lambs are consuming a whole lot less L3 larvae.
Just before you move on, Trev, I've got a specific question about lambs coming on and off chicory. What about a rotation of lambs on crops such as chicory and then 12-plus-month-old pastures, I presume meaning short rotation pastures, are part of the rotation as well? The lambs will bring worms onto the chicory and contaminate the chicory, but the worms won't multiply as quickly as they would on grass. Is that correct?
Absolutely. If we've got a real premier chicory clover, there won't be grass in it, and certainly the where I have been monitoring fecal counts of lambs on chicory clover that don't have grass in them, their worms just don't accumulate. Yeah. And that 1 to 2 year old grass, I'm going to talk about that later with one of the farms, that I'm just going to sort of say what goes on there. The 2 year old grass is that inner lamb finishing system is almost impossible to keep with low levels of L3 challenge. That doesn't need to go back to frequent drenching to keep on top of the worms. And it also makes a big difference whether that new grass is sown in the spring or it's an autumn sown new grass, which if it's autumn sown, it's next season in the late spring and the summer it's going to be still very low challenge, whereas if it's a spring sown new grass, the following year it will be contaminated.
Yeah, and there's two reasons for that with the autumn grass, right? One is that you're then going through the winter where the whole cycle slows down, but also the animals grazing that grass have got a more developed level of immunity than what would summer lambs.
Yes, that's right. So when we look at those other systems, when we've got ewes, they are very effective cleaning. They consume worm larvae but don't add to the contamination. They tend to graze to lower levels, so they let more ultraviolet light in. And as I said at the presentation last week, I've been surprised how effective ewes have been as part of a grazing system to lower the level of challenge to lambs.
Here's a question for you on ewes. So the farms that you work with, are those ewes always in good order? What's the role, or can lots of light ewes trip us up on this one, or tail end ewe mobs trip us up?
No, I think it's a myth that light ewes are contaminators. Some of that stuff we did way back, Ginny, light ewes weren't necessarily bigger contaminators. Most light ewes are not light because they've got worms. Most ewes are not light. Most ewes that are light are because they're either underfed or they've just lost the plot.
Yeah, they're light with worms, not light because of worms.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Someone gave me that the other day. I can't remember who it was, but thank you. I've stolen it.
Yes. So when we look at those options, ewes are very, very effective because of both. They're net decontaminators, and they also they graze to lower covers, so let more light in. So part of a lamb grazing system, they're very powerful. And of course, cattle blocks, as I said, cattle largely don't share worms, so they can be a very effective tool at creating grazing areas that will have a lower level of L3 on them, so therefore lambs have a lower intake. In fact, I think we need to be careful where we have cattle blocks that have a real strong history of cattle blocks, that they can be very clean, and we may need to treat them as if they are like new grass.
I had a guy at a workshop today. They're mostly a heifer block, but they've got 1,000 ewes, and they wean their lambs onto cattle pasture that has had no lambs on it for 9 months, or no sheep on it at all for 9 months. And yeah, I thought that was a perfect example of what you're talking about.
Yeah. So when we look at our lamb finishes, a big risk is that all the livestock are coming from somebody else's farm. And a lot of them, 100% of the lambs in their production system have come in from outside. And that, to me, that carries a huge, huge risk, because, as we know, I mean, in today's world, it's almost normal when we look at a drench test to find that triples are failing. Even 10 years ago, we got excited when we found a triple drench resistance test. Now we get excited when we find a farm that's got low resistant levels of resistance. It is commonplace. Most lambs will carry worms that are probably resistant to triples. And so therefore a solid quarantine procedure is necessary. And now this is a point where it's not simple, because how we handle this depends a lot on the system that you've got. So as a standard routine, those lambs should get a Zolvex or a StarTect, and certainly be off pastures for at least 18 hours. I mean, the textbook is 24 hours, but when you look at the fecal E counts, which I've done some monitoring on, they pretty well at 18 hours, especially if they've been trucked. But then you look at what changes that level of risk. Oh, of course, and then they're grazed on contaminated pastures. So then we look at those things. If those lambs are coming from a known source, and there are some lamb finishers that are now doing that, have identified farms that have got a good drench resistant status, and they are prioritising buying lambs from those farms. So therefore they can adjust what their quarantine treatment is according to that status of the farms. I mean, this is not common, but it's becoming more and more common. I've got a large farm down south that's got almost no drench resistance, and they are getting a premium for their lambs because they are being bought because there's no risk of them bringing on resistant worms. If lambs are coming into a system where the forage system is taking care of the worms, and we have for lamb finishers where this is the case, they have really intensive forage programs, where the forage program, when we've got only ever pastures are being turned over, we can very safely get away with using just Zolvex or StarTect in terms of minimising the risk of bringing on worms that we don't want. Whereas if we have lambs that are coming from an unknown source, and they're coming into a system where they are going to have to be drenched frequently because it's a very pasture-based system, I think they need to be drenched with a quad. And that quad is a Zolvex or StarTect and a drench like Corporal, so a BZ and a levamisole. So a quad to absolutely minimise the risk of purchasing in resistant worms.
And just to clarify that those are not mixed together, they're drenched separately.
That's a good point, Ginny. Yes. Yes, they don't mix.
Yeah, and I was going, phew, I'm glad you said that, because that's how we've got it laid out on the Wormwise website too, that the quad is the gold standard, if you don't know.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
the data does say that there are farms out there that have got some worms that might be surviving Zolvix or StarTech. That said, I presume some of your big finishers are doing lots of monitoring post quarantine,
Yes.
and I know of a couple as well who are only using Zolvix or StarTech as a quarantine and doing lots of monitoring, and are yet to find any of these supposed superworms that are surviving those. But the gold standard is still the quad. I don't know what you're seeing out there.
I that's exactly what I'm finding, and I wonder whether it's those farms that have got, even Zolvix or StarTech resistance, and I've certainly got farms where that's the case. Their lambs just grow so slowly that they're never available to be bought until we sort of get to late autumn into the winter, in which case we stop doing the monitoring, and maybe that's the reason why we don't find them.
I think the other thing that happens is that those lambs get onto your good lamb finishers places and go, holy heck, what's this stuff? And they just eat their heads off.
Yes, that's right. So for lamb finishers where 100% of lambs are coming from somebody else's farms, how you manage those lambs coming in from those farms is hugely, hugely important, particularly if your system is heavily dependent on grass grazing, because the grass will allow those populations to establish and accumulate. So remember that if contamination is allowed to continue, contamination exposure allowed to go for more than 3 cycles, and I think a lot of cases it's 2 cycles, the L3 intake will be limiting live weight gain. And remember that the contamination that we put on our pastures in the autumn will largely still be there in the following spring. So they are accumulative. And so therefore, in a system where we're having to use drench, a robust refugia program has to accompany any drenching. So that is allowing some worms to survive while you keep knocking out the other ones. So just to remind you of the cost of the benefit of having lambs on low larval intake, it is in live weight gain. We just get much better lamb weight gains if lambs are, whoops, somehow I'm having trouble too. So when we look at actual systems, a farm that does 15,000 lambs in its past history, they were based on pastures and so did lots of drenching. And when we have systems like that, one of the features is we get this big range in live weight gains and so variable live weight gains. And so when we look at the doing it differently, so now they do lots of summer crops. The pasture components are short-term. They're only short-term Italian rye, and they make a point of lambs. The pastures that lambs graze in the winter are not grazed by lambs in the autumn, but that is largely because those areas they've been on crops and they've come into their winter crops. This has enabled them to have very, very extended drench intervals. So a lot of lambs from arrival, including their quarantine drench to leaving, would get only 3 drenches and a lot of only 2 drenches in that time. And they get very good live weight gains, extremely good live weight gains, and much, very, very little variability in live weight gains. And interesting, this lamb finisher has purchased ewes of cull ewes to be using on part of their pasture component to lower the level of contamination. So they've compromised, I guess that would appear they've compromised their lamb finishing system by having ewes as part of that, but they're not lambing ewes, they are just trading ewes in effect.
So on that, just before you move on, so those ewes are just coming from all and sundry, potentially carrying drench-resistant worms mixed up with non-drench-resistant worms, but because they're ewes, they are still net removers and are putting some good worms down. Is that a reasonable summary?
Yes, it is. I mean, it's always a question, Ginny, you'll be the same as me, question when ewes are being purchased, should they get the full quarantine procedure? And depending on, generally, in terms of the number relative to the worm population that'll be on that system, I don't think they do need to be. And those ewes will be largely net decontaminators.
Yes, yes. And I think we've got a good couple of practical examples floating around of farms that have really sorted out their drench resistance issues by just buying an undrenched ewes and having them as part of the grazing system, and among other changes, of course.
Yeah.
Question here just on the ewes. Are cattle following the lambs? Do they do as good a job as ewes?
No, I don't think they do. I think the ewes, I don't think the cattle are consumers of L3 larvae or big enough consumers of L3 larvae to alter the population, whereas ewes are, and ewes will also graze to a lower level, which allows this ultraviolet light as one of the tools to lower the contamination. So
However, if we had enough cattle that we had cattle plus time with sort of
yeah,
more area swaps rather than just
yes,
one
yes,
mob of cattle following the lambs, that
yes.
is a different story, isn't it?
Yes, it is. So as I said earlier on, the value of cattle is they're not a sheep, and they're buying time, and so it does allow lamb finishing to sit alongside a cattle system in terms of particularly for the younger cattle, in terms of equally lowering the worm challenge to those cattle, which we'll
Yeah.
talk about next week.
Another question, sorry for you.
Yep.
With the extended drench intervals that you're talking about, how are they measuring and monitoring that? Are they using trigger fecal egg counts? And if so, what is the trigger level?
Okay. I'll come to this later, but we'll address it now because you'll need to hear it twice or more than twice, or you won't remember. Is that as part of any of these changes that we put into place which are designed to have a grazing system which is managing worms, so the level of worm challenge is a lot lower. I make it standard practice that 28 days after they go into that system, they get a fecal egg count. And I rely on that 28-day fecal egg count to help decide what the next action will be.
Mm.
And I insist on them being 10 individuals. I will not at all entertain using composite samples. And I look at those 10, look at how many are low, which, just what constitutes low is going to vary a little bit, but how many are low, how many are high, and from that decide whether that interval could safely be extended by 2 weeks or whether more monitoring should happen in another 2 weeks.
Yep. Yeah, and if you're looking for more information on trigger drenching, levels of FX, and also interpreting composite counts, if you are doing your own, there's a whole page on that on the Wormwise website.
Right. So this is interesting. This is a lamb finishing system on the East Coast that was based around pastures. They were always good quality pastures, but they were very much based around 28-day drenching, and pretty good live weight gains, but again, very variable live weight gains. The system that they now put into place is they've divided the farm into three, and they have 1/3 has a summer crop, and the other 2/3 are Italian rye. And it hasn't fully dealt with it because the second year Italian rye is, depending on how dry it has been. I mean, up that coast they can get dry, but you can't rely on that second year of those Italians being low enough contamination that you can really extend drencher levels. This is a system that I'm encouraging to relook at to try and, because it's not quite achieving the outcome that we wanted. It's a much better outcome than it was, but it's still got too much reliance on drench, and emerging triple resistance means that we have to do better than that. It can't carry on. It's using too much drench in a system where we've got enough tripled resistance to have to be bothered. So this one is a hugely sustainable one, where the farm grows summer and autumn barley, which is harvested in the mid-autumn, goes into Italian ryegrass. Same area, this is into its 5th year, if not 6th year. Same thing happening. Those lambs are quarantine drenched onto that Italian ryegrass. They're not drenched again. They just grow so fast and then they're gone. And if you looked at a sustainable lamb finishing system, this is it, because in the same areas, it's on the same areas, growing very good crops of barley, and the lambs are are going on to worm-free, high quality grass, and they grow over the winter and are killed in the early spring. Monitoring. So this has to be in the toolbox. Soon as we change our grazing system where we expect the level of challenge to be lower, we have to do monitoring. We can't carry on just drenching. In fact, there is a huge danger of carrying on drenching if we are setting up a low challenge grazing system. And if anything, the monitoring, it's giving us the confidence that what we're doing is actually making a difference. Fecal egg count is monitoring. For all the weaknesses of fecal egg counting, it is still a tool which is good enough for us to make decisions with. And we can use it for driving drench usage in a changed system. We cannot use it as a drench trigger where we are in contaminated environments, because the fecal egg counts will change so quickly, and production costs, there will be production costs to that. So as I said earlier on, 28 days post drenching onto whatever system is when I like to fecal egg count. And I do this even on when they're going on to what I think are clean grazing systems. And it's really, certainly in the early days with someone who's doing this, it's just to give them confidence of what that summer forage system is doing. So 28-day fecal egg counts, 10 samples, and make a decision about what the next action will be based on that 10, that fecal egg count. And I think, particularly for lamb finishers, is 10 days after an early summer drench and 10 days after an autumn drench, do a fecal egg count. It is such an easy way of keeping track of how effective is the product that you're drenching with is. In any system, I recommend that this is a standard monitoring component to that system.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important point for people buying stock on the basis of drench testing information as well. A farm might have a fecal egg count reduction test that was done in January, but it might not be very reflective of some resistant trikes that can be there later in the autumn. And for me, if I was buying lambs from a breeder, I would want to see more than just one drench check or just one reduction test. I'd want to see ongoing monitoring showing that those drenches were effective for me to be confident that I could buy them in without a quarantine.
Yeah.
Question here on the post-drench check. Can the drench test 10 days post-drench be a composite sample?
Absolutely not.
Can I butt in?
Yeah, okay.
I think it can. I think it can, and if it's 0, that's probably okay. If it's not 0, we want more information.
Yes, no, you did right.
Cut me down.
Yes. I've had so many situations of a composite, of doing 10 at any of these situations, whether it's 10 days post drench or 28 days, where we might have 9 of them that are all below 200, and we've got one that's 2,000. Now, I can't explain why one's 2,000, but when we've got a composite, it just puts us in nowhere land. We just don't know what we're dealing with. That's why I so value 10.
Yeah, and so do I, but I guess we do have to acknowledge that lots of people out there have got feed pack machines now, and I think the I was just having a conversation with one of them today, and I think the key with those composite samples is to do lots of them, like not waiting 2 weeks, like doing them every 4 or 5 days, even when you're in that zone where you think the effects might be starting to go up, is to do them really regularly. And it's not waiting for some magic trigger level, it's when they start to go up. And the people I was talking to today, they're managing to get 9 and 10 week drench intervals on their lambs on low contamination feed, but they're not waiting for some magical 300 or 500 or whatever. It's when they start to go that they'll drench.
Yeah. I think this whole multiple thing's something to talk about more at some stage, because I'm a bit uncomfortable how widely it's becoming accepted without recognising its weaknesses. And certainly for doing drench checks, there's no way that I would rely on a composite. So warnings. So when I talked right at the start about that worm cycle and how the environment affects it, and so when we look at if it's dry, that whole free living stage doesn't happen. If it's cold, that whole free living stage doesn't happen. When it's dry, those L3 larvae scurry off down into the soil. They don't like being dry. So the impact of a summer dry compared to a wet summer, you look at those farms north of Napier into their 4th wet summer, the level of trikes is huge, because they've just been allowed, the environment, the weather, the circumstances have allowed trikes to absolutely dominate and contaminate. When we're looking at highly contaminated farms, and we start putting a forage systems or a grazing system into place to lower the contamination, it takes time. We very seldom can actually do it in 1 year. It takes 2, in some cases 3 years, to actually lower the contamination to enough. And this probably doesn't apply to lamb finishing systems, because they tend to be not in that like that. And if we're dealing with severe drench resistance, we have to do something significantly different to manage worms in a way that's not reliant on drench. So finally, to do tomorrow, think about how you might change your system sometime over the next 2 years to lower the level of L3 larvae to grazing lambs. And it is about breaking that contamination exposure cycle. It is about doing some monitoring, and it is about feeding them well. And also do some basic monitoring around drench effectiveness. 10 days early summer, 10 days in the autumn. And why I say that both times is that in the early summer we'll have minimal number of trikes, whereas in the autumn we may have an absolute dominance of trikes. So we're looking at often 2 different worm populations, hence monitoring at 2 ends of the season.
Yeah, great point. There's a question here to do with the detail of quarantine. Is there a place for more collaboration between breeders, finishers, agents and sale yards, etc. on standoff time? If you're a finisher and buying 100% of your lambs in, and the lambs have had a long journey and been through the yards, that can put people off doing a proper quarantine and stand down. Do you see a way that there could be a system where we could pay breeders for the lambs to be drenched prior to trucking, so that the standoff's being done on the truck effectively? Okay, that old chestnut.
Okay, in my experience, you cannot rely on that. I've had too many cases where that was the arrangement. We fecal air count lambs after they've arrived, and they've got decent air count, so they were never drenched. So it has to be.
I was going to say, I know supposedly integrated farming groups where the managers don't trust each other to get this job done properly.
That's right.
So I would love it. I would love it if we could make that work. And Kate, I agree, getting stock agents on board is a great big battle. So it's one of those, to me, it's this kind of mecca that's out there in the future that I don't know how we can make it work. I don't know how we can make it work.
No, but I agree with the sentiment of who had that question, that I think a lamb that's been on a truck for a few hours is probably going to empty out pretty fast. They're going to be given the mess in those lambs after they've been trucked. They're pretty well emptied out. And I guess just with all this stuff, it's generally following these sort of rules, and nothing's perfect, and there'll be reasons why some things don't quite work. But in general, these things I've been talking about do work, and the value of doing it better is huge in terms of lamb live weight gain, and that's the prize.
Yeah, and I guess back to that quarantine thing too, where you can't do it perfectly, you do know where those lambs have gone after you got them.
Yes.
So there might be a few paddocks that lambs had got quarantined into because you couldn't stand them off. Well, you know which those paddocks are. You can then make some sort of plan to make sure that a whole bunch of lambs don't keep rotating through those paddocks and breeding up those worms. Can they get grazed with cattle for ages? Can they get sprayed out for a crop? Everybody's going to have something different that they can do.
So, Ginny, you'll know the farm up the road, up Kimbolton Road, does lots of lamb finishing. We had this discussion way back around the importance of standing them off. He has put hay racks around a big yard, and those lambs are drenched and put out into a non-grass yard.
Yep.
And they eat hay, and it is amazing how much hay they eat. And
I've been surprised. Yep.
and he thinks that it helps them with their transition from where they were onto where they're going. So in his case, he's actually conquered that difficulty by actually setting a system up by where he can effectively hold them off for quite some time, but not starve them.
The other thing I'd say on behalf of my sheep dairy people is don't be a snob about buying dairy sheep lambs, because they already know how to eat anything you want to feed them. You can give them anything in the yards and they'll eat it.
If you don't, they die.
They like to be well fed.
Yes, they do. Right, Michaela, we've gone over time.
We have, but it's all good conversation, so that's all good. I'll give you another 30 seconds or so to chuck any questions in there, but just as a wrap up, thank you, Trevor and Ginny, again for your time. Like I said last week, it's very, very tough to get you guys, so we appreciate you making the time for us. Next week we'll be focusing on cattle, so same time, same place next week. Just register as you did this week to get the link, and we will get the recordings out to you that will come alongside some feedback, so we'd really appreciate your feedback for these two, because we're always looking to improve. So